Well, hey everyone, welcome to today's episode of The Digital Difference. And today's episode will be with myself, Scott Gulliver, and Oliver Moradi.
Hi guys.
So today we wanted to talk about prototyping, and we thought it'd be a great subject to talk to you about today because it's still one of those things that's not very widely used, and it's still quite a scary concept, I think, to some companies and some people, especially those who haven't stepped into that world before. But it's actually a really easy thing to get started with. There are loads of tools out there that we'll talk about today that can help you get started with it, and just in principle, it's quite an easy thing to get going with. So to start off, if we talk about what prototyping is, just at the bare basics level, and it's really about helping to understand and explore products and experiences in the very early stages of development. And prototyping really is a lightweight way of getting a solution in front of whoever you need to be able to show it off or to test it before you get into the actual build of it.
Yeah, keyword there is lightweight as well, isn't it, Scott? So, when you prototype, it's not that full product that you're doing. You're not. I think a lot of people think when they prototype, they're creating like the full package, and they're going to be delivering that full package to someone. But it's not like that at all, is it? It's more like that sort of high level product that can kind of demonstrate what your final output's going to be. Mm-hmm. But as it is simply, it's just that high level product. It's definitely not the full package. So and prototyping often doesn't go on for a long time either. It's usually something that you would create within like a week or so.
Yeah, lightweight is interesting because we definitely need to be using prototyping to figure things out quite quickly, I think. And I think equally, there's no harm in creating prototypes just to eventually throw them away, especially once you've got into the builders make, or if they just haven't proved useful. So there doesn't need to be this pressure on creating something that looks really good and, like you say, spending a lot of time on it. Obviously, you've been in the design world for a while now, Ollie, and what's your experience of prototyping in design?
Yeah, so we like to use the design thinking method, and that's from the empathize stage to the test stage. So and in there, obviously, within the middle of that, there you have the prototype stage, which is what would be relevant to this right now. And it usually takes about a week. Again, it is very high level. Sometimes for me as a learning designer, it's usually a couple of slides of what the learning could look like. Very high level stuff, not much content in there, more about how the thing can function and how it can look. And it like I said before, it's more of a high level overview of what the actual product, the end product's going to look like in the end state, more than anything else. It's about showing a look and feel. I can imagine for anybody else, for whatever work you're in, I don't know, if you're building a robot, for instance, it's probably like something small level that this robot could do, maybe even just demonstrating some sketch. It could be anything, just demonstrating sketches to, to maybe like a mini model. But it doesn't have to, when you say prototype, it doesn't have to be a finished article or anything like that. It's a very base model, and it doesn't always have to be even created. It can just sometimes just be those sort of sketches just to show a look and feel and how it's going to function.
So you're using it as kind of a way to figure out the broad approach to a problem, right? You said you weren't focusing on the detail, but I guess you're figuring out the structure and, as you said, the look and feel and all of those high level things first. And you're using prototypes to figure those out before you spend much time on the content.
Absolutely. And I think this is what the whole point of having a prototype is. It's to figure out what the end state's going to look like. If you don't have the end state in mind and you don't have an idea of what you want to do, hence the ideate stage within the design thinking period, you're not going to have a decent product at the end of it.
Yeah, it's a great way, I think, to figure out those broad strokes. I think fundamentally, though, like prototyping is just a cost-effective way to validate pretty much any design decision, isn't it? And you're right, like those broad strokes and the look and feel, those are really costly things to get wrong if you go through a full cycle of design and implementation before you get out to your customers. So I think any design decisions that you want to validate, and we've talked at length before about how important validation is and testing your assumptions. I think if you can really spend some time building prototypes to test those things, whether that be on the broader solution or the more fun details, then it's a really great tool to bring out. And I think the other thing as well is that actually it can help to bring about some more creative solutions. there's this thing with prototyping where, because it's quite easy to do and quite easy to tweak things and change things and throw away designs and try something new as well, I think you find people getting a bit more creative. Whereas if you're down the road in a system already, so say you've already got a product that's been pretty well developed, or you're developing a new product that's within a suite, you might find that those constraints maybe limit you a bit more. Whereas prototyping is just such a lightweight process that actually it makes more sense to just try things, see how they go, and be ready to throw them away if you need to. And the other good thing is, so there's always this question of why bother, and I think it's a relevant thing, especially in today's age where we're so fast moving, and there's this notion of, is prototyping just adding more, another step into the mix that we don't need? But I think hopefully it's been proven by a lot of the bigger companies that it is really useful to spend time on, and it's almost an investment as well if you spend time in the prototyping stage. Like you said, Ollie, especially with design thinking strapped around it, if you spend more time in the design stage and the prototyping stage figuring things out, you'll spend much less time and money in the build stage just to find out that you've got things slightly wrong. So it really should be seen as an investment.
Yeah, definitely. It's one of those things that was really useful. And I'm coming back to the end state again, but it's really useful to define what your end state's going to look like, because a prototype can actually, when you create it, can actually show you that it's not what you want. It's not the end product that you're envisioning, and then it's all about taking it back to the drawing board and figuring out where the tweaks and where you need to change that product to make sure that you have a decent output, and you have that output that you envision for this product. I think that the problem is that a lot of people don't bother prototyping, in my opinion, and they go straight into the build. And then in the end of the day, they're going to have this output, this build, this product that they haven't prototyped, and they don't like the output, and then it becomes another wasted product.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot more focus on the design stage, I think, aren't we? Which is a great start in the whole process. And a lot more companies are turning to either design teams or just a notion of designing something before they actually sit down to create it. But I think the great thing about prototypes, as you say, is to go beyond just wireframes or pictures on a page, and actually wiring them up into a prototype that works in some regard can actually help you understand the flow a lot better, help you understand how it all fits together, and kind of that whole picture as well, the bigger picture of the whole thing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is where design thinking comes in. And I think this is where people are starting to really adopt that design thinking approach, because it's so important, this prototyping stage. And design thinking really incorporates it as one of its 5 key principles. So I think this is why people are actually using it, because it's now easy to prototype, and it's easy to throw out these ideas to understand what your end state's going to be, and to understand what your final product's going to look like. And also to have it agreed and signed off early, have all parties who are involved to have that recognition that, they're all happy with what it's going to look like.
Yeah, I totally agree. Design thinking, I think, really, again, it sounds like one of those scary concepts to people who don't know much about it, but it's a very easy format to follow, isn't it? And the great thing about it is that something like prototyping, when you're new to digital products anyway, it's hard to know where to slot prototyping in, and that becomes a lot easier to think about once you've done it a few times. But design thinking kind of walks you through that process and has it, as you say, as part of its core. So it's a great format to follow when you're just getting started, or even a seasoned team can use it to just walk through new products and new problems as they come up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the other thing as well is, of course, is that prototyping doesn't need specialists to think about it. Certainly people who have a design mindset, or even developers in that space, can help you to make sure that you're using the right tools and get you on board. But I think actually that it's a great tool for just stakeholders and others to think about as well. I think that the more a team as a whole can think about this, and that's all people in the room, and use prototypes to maybe get ideas out of their head, and to really articulate what they're thinking, and get that in front of the whole team, it can be really useful. And this is where I think thinking about the fidelity, as we call it, of a prototype can be useful. So there's kind of the 2 ends of the spectrum of prototyping. You've got the really low fidelity stuff where it really might just be kind of paper mock-ups, or even just wireframes on perhaps a whiteboard or something that you've drawn lines between and you're taking people through. they certainly have a very valid place, I think, in the design process. And then on the other end of the scale, you've got the really high fidelity mock-ups where it's almost hard to distinguish it from what the end product's going to be. It looks very similar. It's wired up using some tool, and it feels basically like the app or the experience that you're going to be creating anyway. But the low fidelity stuff, I think, is a really great jumping in point for people who, especially for those teams who are maybe just getting started with creativity or with exploration of digital products. It's a really good way of just getting, as I say, what's in your head out. So just taking people through a whiteboard and drawing that out and literally taking people through the screens can be a great way just to show people through what you're thinking. Ollie, in your work, do you see many other kind of team disciplines? Is it just your designers that are using prototyping, or what's your experience of others either using them or being introduced to them?
My experience has always been low fidelity because we don't have time to create high fidelity stuff. I can imagine that the high fidelity stuff usually needs about 3 months of work at least to produce a prototype that's near to the end state. And for us, we don't have that time. That 3 months is the complete build time. So usually the high fidelity stuff will be out the window. So it's all about that low fidelity, that paper mock-up, if you will. And again, because we take that approach of design thinking, we usually have around a day that we do produce these kind of things. So for me, the way that I practice design thinking, especially within my role, is to create maybe a 1 or 2 slide presentation of how my product will look and function. By the end of it, people can click through. There'll be a few bits of functionality in there, but overall, it's not going to be out of this world. It's not going to be anywhere near what the final build's going to look like. So it's always been the low fidelity. And personally, if I was to give anybody advice, I would say that going the low fidelity route is probably the best way, because you don't want to spend months and months and months prototyping something to then turn around and have your test or whoever your stakeholders are come in and say, no, we don't like this product. You have to go back to the drawing board, and then you have to scrap this product that you've done, that you spent so much time and work on, and you've wasted loads of money and resource on it as well. So for me, it would be all about that low fidelity. I understand that sometimes there is a place for high fidelity stuff. And there is a place for people to use that kind of that near end state product as a prototype, because they'll build a prototype from that prototype until they get it right. So no matter what, that product's actually going to look near the end state, and it's designed to be that way. It just needs tweaking. So whoever comes in and says, actually, we don't like that, it's kind of like, well, this is what the product is. It just needs tweaking. So that's why you'd probably have like 30 or 40 different prototypes or versions of something that's just slightly tweaked before you get the final output. But if you're at the beginning stages, and I think this is where prototyping really comes in with the ideate stage, and throwing out those ideas. If you've got an idea but you're not quite sure on it and it hasn't been signed off and not everybody's on board, then it'd be that 1 to 2 day turnover in prototyping. If you've got the idea but that everybody's on board and everybody kind of understands what the end product's going to be, then you have more time to work on that prototype, because you kind of do have that end state and that end product in mind. You just know it needs tweaking, so you can start prototyping really early.
That's really interesting to hear that it takes kind of 3 months in your area to create the high fidelity mock-ups. And I guess that's because you're dealing with a lot of copy driven stuff and a lot of stuff that's focused on, especially with learning, a lot of like expert driven copy and content. So that must take a long time to actually develop. But yeah, that's really interesting. And I think you're right. The low fidelity stuff, although to some it will seem like, why bother with this level of very simple layout and design. But the great thing about low fidelity, actually, like you said, even with the paper prototypes and all that sort of stuff, they get people away from the detail of like, I want that button color to change, and more into just like, is this the right approach to begin with? Like the more fundamental problems. And I think the problem is when people see a really high fidelity mock-up, something that looks really real, often people are afraid to use too many negative challenges against something because they think so much time has been put into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the problem that you'll often find with the high fidelity mock-ups and the high fidelity prototyping is that if it hasn't been signed off early doors and someone's put way too much effort into it and that gets shut down immediately, that's just seen as a massive failure to a project.
Yeah.
Or to whatever product you've built. So straight away you're starting on sort of this downhill, and it's not just about, I don't know, maybe we're going a bit too deep into this, but I don't think it's just about the prototyping in itself. I mean, if you spend 3 months prototyping something and someone turns around and says, actually, no, we don't want to use this, which has happened to me before, by the way. Like I have worked in an area where I've been prototyping for a very long time. 3 months later, someone said, actually, we're just going to scrap this. We don't want it anymore. I also work partly within film production, and that happens quite a lot as well. Mm-hmm. It's quite disheartening to then go and pick that project back up and take it in a new direction. So I'd say that there is a big issue there. But what I would suggest is with that low fidelity, that sort of 2-day prototyping, it takes away that risk that it's going to get down to a later stage. You're going to build a product that you're really happy with, and it's not going to get signed off. And stakeholders are key to any sort of prototype. Stakeholders are key to whether it's going to get signed off or not. In the end of the day, it's being built for them more than anything else. And you need to keep them happy. So keeping them in the loop during your prototyping stages, even if you want to put stages within your prototype to make sure that you're keeping them on board, do that. If you're going to be going for a longer than a couple of day period of building a prototype. But I really would suggest not to go ahead, build a massive prototype that no one has any involvement in, and it's be completely like trashed. Probably one of the most disheartening things you could ever happen to you, really.
Yeah, there's a fine line between wanting to show off a good idea, isn't there, and putting a lot of time into that, and going too far and then getting so invested in it that it's too hard to really. And it's important to not get too invested as well, or to be able to receive criticism, because of course the whole point of doing this process is to find what doesn't work and what does work, and try and find a way forward. So yeah, that there really is a fine line between the two. But erring on the side of lower fidelity and lower, I guess, quality, for want of a better word, can be a really useful way of just validating those early ideas.
It's quite a key word you've just said there as well, quality, which I found quite a few times. You've built a product that's really high quality and it's got a lot of functionality in it, and it's great. And you've taken it through to your test stage, and your stakeholders have turned around and said, actually, it's too good. And that might sound like really showy, but it's the quality's too good for what we're trying to output. You know, there's too much functionality in here. It's too over complex, and you know, we're not ready for this kind of product. You know, because sometimes a product is reliant on other things. I mean, particularly for me in my world, it would be network issues. For instance, if I build a product that's over 50 megabytes, I've got a problem. As a package, I've got a problem. So it's a huge issue there. I think that the problem is if people don't have that signed off and there's a quality discrepancy there, then you literally do have to take your product back to the stage one again, because you can build quality right into the foundations of a product, and if you have to start stripping it out, you may as well just start again.
Yeah, and what a great way for prototyping to help identify those issues before you get to them in the production phase and have to undo things. I think equally as well that even if there are problems that you highlight, like you said, if there's something that you introduce in a prototype that's a feature that looks great, but there are too many technical issues to implement at the time, then maybe that's a good discussion point to be had. And maybe, again, the great thing about the prototypes are they bring to life the features, I think, rather than just talking about how useful a feature would be to an individual and how much effort it would take to get around that problem. You can put it in front of a customer and actually gauge feedback before you even build it.
Yeah. Kind
of imagine that future state and a perfect world before you have to spend the time and money actually getting it right.
Yeah, definitely.
So I wanted to talk, this is probably jumping ahead a little bit, but about what tools can help. And I think this is useful just to cement the idea in people's heads of how prototyping works, because as I say, a lot of the tools out there are really easy to use. On one end of the spectrum, you've got kind of purpose-built design tools. So on one end of the scale, you've got purpose-built design and prototyping tools, and these are, for example, Figma. Adobe XD is another great one. Framer is another one, and these are all tools. They all have various levels of either free or or low priced to get started with them. And they're basically designed for you to build pretty high fidelity mock-ups, and also wire them together into prototypes that you can give to someone and they can click through on a screen. This works really well for anything digital, really. So if you're building websites, building apps, any of the kind of those sort of delivered experiences, it's a great way to get quite close to that end product in the design phase. And they're getting easier to use as well. What I would say is don't shy away, that they can seem pretty daunting, but a lot of them come with great explanations or tutorials, and they are really good ways of just getting into that mindset of digital development as well. I say a lot of them as well have free plans or free trials, so you can definitely evaluate them before committing, and they're really good just to help think through a solution before you get to it.
I'd also like to throw in there PowerPoint. I think PowerPoint's a really good tool. It's really useful for just building basic concepts as well. It has minor functionality in there. There's mini animations. So if you're building a little website, for instance, you can mimic some of the animations that you would do as well. So just to sort of show off those 1 to 2 pages is really useful. I know that a lot of people might be going, "Oh, PowerPoint, it's not quite that. It's not professional. It's what kids use." But it has increased its functionality in recent years, and it is actually really good tool to use just for that real basic design. And if you want a quick solution as well, it's perfect. It's really easy to use. So that is something else I'd like to throw in there.
Yeah, I totally agree. PowerPoint, Keynote, all those types of software, like most of us have them anyway on our PCs, especially those that are in the Microsoft space. And again, like especially for those kind of stakeholders who are just trying to draw up something in their heads, just getting the shape tools out on PowerPoint, dragging some rectangles around and mimicking what the app might kind of look like. And then wiring up some screens can be a really useful way of just trying to test an idea or just get it in front of someone.
And
so
the great thing about these tools as well is that they're all competing against each other now. So you'll find that the functionality is getting better and better and better from all these different tools because they're all competing against each other, and they all want to keep their market share, if you will. They want to keep their customer base. And to do that, they have to increase their functionality. They have to increase how well they work. And I think that's why you can use all these tools, and there's so many free options out there for you guys to use.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then that kind of wraps up, I think, most of the software solution space. You've got on one end, you've got things that really probably aren't designed for that stuff like PowerPoint, and then you've got the more purpose-built tools. I think the offline stuff is worth thinking about as well, though. So it used to be, although it's probably reserved for Instagram now, that people would create really pretty high fidelity mock-ups with using paper and kind of sellotape almost in a way, literal things you can drag around and kind of move around in the frame of an app. And again, it's just to kind of show what would happen. Normally, if you do have them, you might have a screen on every page, for example, and you'd normally have someone facilitating. So if someone pretends to press a button, you can move it to the right page, for example. They're probably a lot more work to put into now, especially now we've got some of these more purpose-built tools that do the job a lot better. But they do still have their place, especially if you're a really old school company who's still doing things pretty offline. They can be a great way just to get started. There should be no barriers really to do prototyping. And then of course you can go through to things like whiteboards even. So just drawing screens on a whiteboard and wiring them up just by drawing lines to one another can be a simple way just to get, especially with those more simple concepts, just to get the ideas across to someone. And it's worth thinking about how they've changed as well. So the tools, as I say, are becoming a lot easier to use. I mean, Ollie, have you noticed much of a change in the tools over the past several years that you've been using them?
Yeah, definitely. And I think this comes hand in hand with technology. The tools have developed massively to be, in fact, to be honest with you, they've become simplified in a sense, that everything's become simplified, so people can use them. Anybody can really use them, to be honest. It's become one of those situations where I think design and creativity is at the hands of everybody now, especially with the introduction of social media and all these different creative apps and add-ons that you can do on your phone. So everything through social media now is, I don't know, people are doing stuff that 10 years ago would have been really hard to do as a developer, I think. And now with a touch of a button, people can develop these GIFs and these mini movies and these TikToks and all this kind of stuff. It makes me sound so old, doesn't it, when I'm saying, back in the day. But it's true. Like 10 years ago, it would have been quite hard to do a lot of this stuff. And I think that now it's become a touch for fingertips. So I think for developers and stuff, and designers, we see that sort of back end stuff that people are doing daily as one of those things that we don't need to do anymore. So I think these programs do a lot for you, and their whole foundation of each program now is built around to help you, almost like a digital assistant. You know, if we're going to touch on last week's episode, you know, it's almost got that functionality, like it's there to help you constantly, and it's there to do the hard bits for you. Take Webflow, for instance, Scott. I mean, it writes the code for you. It's so much easier to design in Webflow now. For a designer, I don't need to have many skills in HTML and JavaScript, etc., to go and build a proper website. 10 years ago, Dreamweaver, trying to do the same thing, I mean, it was mental. The amount of rubbish that and code that program used to throw out was insane. You know, you'd have so many bugs in it and stuff like that. So I think that definitely, for me, I've seen a massive improvement. But to be honest with you, it's more about the user experience of each program more than anything else. And also, yeah, the capability is always going to come hand in hand with that. You know, technology is rapidly developing, so everybody can do things, but how easy it is to do things is really what's stuck out for me.
Yeah, it's more on the design side for me, but the like you mentioned, the capability of some tools to be able to write code. And I think we should be wary still of those kind of prototyped app solutions that are out there at a turn of a button. But certainly some of the more involved programs like Webflow do a great job. The other interesting developments for me are more in the design space. So
it's interesting you say that, actually, Scott, that me as a designer saying, oh, it's pretty easy for the developing bits for me, and you as a developer saying, oh, it's the design bits for me. So I guess it's what's
yeah.
been what's not our forte, I guess. It's doing that other bit for you.
Yeah, and like the handoff, I think, is much better now as well. So when you're like traditionally handing designs, let alone prototypes, over to a development team, has been a really hard thing to do, because you're often showing something that looks really good, but maybe it doesn't scale to all screens or all devices, and it's hard. The developers have to do that translation, or there's a lot of back and forth to figure out what should happen in different scenarios. Whereas like Figma, for example, so we use Figma here at Fluff, and that's developed to a point now where we can create prototypes that do adjust to the screen as you're scaling them up and down. And not only that, you can actually start scaffolding your kind of designs and your components in such a way that they make a lot of sense to a developer. So one of their newer features, for example, is the ability when we create, for example, a button in Figma in our designs, you can create variants of it. And what that really helps a development team to do is to understand that is fundamentally the same thing as another button, but they vary in this way. So when you start to mirror these concepts in both the design and the prototype and the development stage, they're really easy to translate back and forth, which makes it so much easier.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so if we want to have a look at kind of where this fits in, I think there is again a large scale of where it can fit into an organization. I think it changes quite a lot as to how you use prototyping, depending on the size and the focus of your company. I think in the more simpler thing to think about really is more of the kind of technical freelancers or agencies. And in this instance, prototyping is a great way to show concepts to a client. Again, it's all about getting people on the same page and having something to talk around. And I think a prototype is a great way to do that before you've spent any time actually on the development itself. Really easy to change, really easy to agree on everything before you go into a more expensive stage of the process. The next stage is really the kind of smaller companies, maybe companies that are testing new ideas with their customers. I think in this instance, it probably makes sense to focus more on one-on-one feedback. So actually having something that's a lot more low fidelity, something that's just knocked up quick and easily that you can kind of walk people through, and you might even have a bit of a script around how you take people through it, can be really useful. And then of course, the other thing as well is with a lot of these software solutions like Figma and XD, you can publish them on the internet and give a link to someone and actually get feedback that way. So it's really easy to start distributing ideas and concepts to a small group of customers that you might want to get feedback from.
Definitely, and I can't stress that enough, how easy it is with this whole sharing button now. Instead of back in the day where you had to package everything up, try and send it over email, which would never work. So it would be sending it on a memory stick to someone. just this idea of just sharing over the cloud and having these cloud-based products that you put up there and anybody can kind of access is amazing, absolutely amazing, and it adds so much value and it reduces so much time. So if you guys can use any sort of cloud-based tools, I'd definitely recommend it. It just cuts off so much time and adds so much value to your end-to-end process.
Yeah, especially if you're introducing prototyping for the first time, reducing the barrier to entry for anyone who even might be on board, like is going to be useful just to get people into the whole process.
Yep.
I think for medium-sized companies, there's an interesting space to introduce prototyping into at the moment, especially for those companies that might be big enough to have a dedicated digital team or product team. And I think for those, actually, it's a great opportunity for those teams specifically to show ideas to, like you said, to stakeholders within the organization, and also to obviously test externally with customers. And I think certainly the lower fidelity stuff you can probably start to use as a talking piece within the company, refine it, and then get it out to a customer base to test with a more high fidelity mock-up. And then larger organizations, of course, are a lot more complicated to think about. Perhaps those companies are really departmental. I mean, Ollie, you've worked for a lot of large orgs. Where have you seen prototyping used? You obviously use it a lot within your design team. Is there anywhere else you see it in the organization, or is it pretty restricted just for the design teams at the moment?
I think in everywhere, definitely within change and transformation, massively used there. I think it's one of those situations where everybody's using prototyping now, just because, and again, it comes back to that low fidelity prototyping, that lower key prototyping, because there are so many ideas being thrown out there. And when you work in a larger organization, there's a lot of conflicting opinions. So you don't want to commit to any one idea. You don't want to commit to any one prototype, throw it out there, like I've said, because it can end in disaster. And before you know it, you've wasted time and the project's going to want to know how that time and resource is going to be handed back to them. So it's one of those situations where you have to work in an efficient and agile way. And because of that, you get that low fidelity prototyping. But prototyping is definitely used business wide, without a doubt. Me, again, like I've said, I see it mainly in change and transformation. I think that a lot of the digital areas, for instance, as well.
That's really good to hear. That is really good. And obviously, you're working for a lot of pretty mature companies, and that's really good to hear that that's the way that they're paving for almost the rest of us, I guess, in a way. Yeah, that's really good. Just before we wrap up, I wanted to just touch on one more concept, and that is we've obviously talked around using prototypes as a way to really validate a concept before you go through it. But I think there's also a way that we can use prototyping to iterate on an idea as well. And I think for that, it's useful to think about prototypes almost as living documents. It's almost to the point where once you've built a solution, it might be worth coming back and making sure the prototype's updated, because any future features, you might want to go back through the same loop again of designing the new feature, prototyping it within the prototype first, and then building beyond that. It certainly has a lot of place within new product development, but I think just for those smaller features and to be able to have something that's not the actual built solution that you can all come back to and comment on and recommend features for, having that kind of living document almost as a blueprint of the main thing can be really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think that it's maybe the new way of prototyping. This is sort of the new way that people are going to start doing it.
Absolutely agree. I think that we're definitely seeing a change in the way people are using prototyping internally, especially with the whole agile process, as people get more mature with that. The other thing as well, I think a prototype, especially with the tools that are out there, like the more cloud-based solutions, like you said, they really do encourage almost ownership of a design within a team. Little things just like encouraging inline comments and comments around the prototype and discussion around certain features. That type of stuff is really useful in just driving some ownership within a team and getting some proactive feedback.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the ownership is key as well. You need someone to be driving and leading the prototyping, and if they're not, then you've got issues, because if everybody's delving in from that ideate stage to that prototyping stage, I think whether they're so closely linked, those two stages, if you have two people putting in an idea that aren't quite on board, then your prototype's going to look very odd. And I think that, that's why you always need someone to lead, to have the final say and have the final input.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You definitely need, like you said, I don't know what that is. Maybe that role as a product owner in some companies, or a design lead or something. You definitely need someone to own the final product, I think, and make those decisions, don't you? But I think it's equally important just to ensure that you do get people commenting as much as they possibly can. So actually getting those conflicting ideas in the first place is as useful as deciding between them in the end, because that's the problem you get otherwise is that people are reluctant to even add suggestions or comments. And I think as much as you can get the team owning the product as a whole, like the whole team, that can be really valuable in just driving innovation and ideas and everything else. And then ultimately having someone who can decide between those in a fair way is super useful.
It's why having initial design sessions or initial ideate sessions before prototyping is really useful, because it gets everybody on board as well. Not only does it promote innovation, it promotes team synergy, if you will. So it's one of those things where everybody can sort of be on board with an idea, everybody can have their input on that idea, but the prototype hasn't been built yet. If you haven't had that ideate stage, you haven't had that team meeting, that and everyone hasn't got into a room and literally discussed it beforehand, everybody will have these different conflicting ideas for what the prototype should actually look like. And before you know it, if everybody's working on one prototype, for instance, and you have one of those real-time sharing documents and you're throwing in ideas, it can just become a mess.
Yeah, they're a great way to get people engaged and excited, aren't they, for a project, but also, as you say, just hammer out some of those more fundamental decisions as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's, as well as getting feedback through things like the comments and the discussion features of some of the software solutions out there, just getting user feedback sessions is great, even just one-on-ones. Using prototypes as a way to get in front of a customer and just get some actual feedback is really useful. And I think a lot of that can be done remote and virtual now, and the software's getting a lot better, especially since we've all been home for the past year. And there are a lot of great solutions out there that can help you to conduct almost remote feedback sessions. So they can be a really useful way of getting active feedback on the prototypes you've created. Cool. So just to wrap up then and kind of summarize, I think prototypes are a useful tool for almost any team that's creating products and experiences for their users or even internally, just to use. And if you haven't used them before, just give them a try and you may find them have a natural place in your process going forward. There are loads of easy tools to get started with. And just have a think about your next project, try and introduce it. And especially at the early stage, it can be really useful. And if you are struggling and think it might be useful, there are, of course, loads of external companies out there that are ready to help with it and can certainly help you with some of the ideation and also getting some of the processes and the prototyping tools up and running for you. So that's it for us today. As always, catch you in the next one, and thanks for listening.